Well, let's begin our study of the rain horse. We have a young man out in a world where he doesn't really belong. Even from the beginning of the story, Ted Hughes emphasises that this guy is out of his depth. We're told he has come too far. In this first page, Ted Hughes emphasises for a number of occasions that this young man is in a place which he knew when he was a child. We're told he pleasantly remembered it, and that 12 years ago was when he was last here. In fact, he'd also used this place as a target. He's come back to somewhere that he knew as a child, that maybe he grew up in. However, he seems to be out of place now. We're told that he's out of place. Let's summarise for a moment what we've got. We have a young man. He grew up here, but he's out of place. So let's now look at the world that this young man has come into. It's cold, it's bare, it's black, it's sodden. The weather is absolutely filthy, the rain is falling hard. Ted Hughes suggests that in this sort of bleak, unrestrained natural world, we can't expect the meaningful sensation of a tourist or something which we might enjoy returning to a place of our childhood. It's interesting that Ted Hughes emphasises how the man's dressed. We've been told early on that he's wearing a grey suit, and at the bottom of the first page, his new suit and his shoes are reminded to us of the fact that they'll be ruined. I think Ted Hughes is asking us to think about his priorities. When this young man was a boy, he used to go shooting rabbits in this part of the world. He recalls the valley very well from his childhood, but this is no longer the place he once knew. So on the second page, we start seeing the dilemma that the young man faces. Ted Hughes uses what we call free, indirect discourse. And in doing this, he evokes the man's thoughts and gives us an insight into his mind. We're told that it would be quicker to go straight for the farm. There, it's the young man's thoughts being articulated to us as a reader. It's a very important element of Ted Hughes' style in this story, for us to be able to identify and understand how the man sees the world. However, this young man is stubborn and also embarrassed that he no longer belongs in this environment. We're told he doesn't want to be embarrassingly remembered or shouted at. And so, he's stuck out in this landscape. He feels a wave of anger. And Ted Hughes develops this idea by talking about the anger he feels against himself for, and an important word, blundering into this trap. And also an anger against the land that made him feel outcast. We feel that this young man at this stage experiences resentment, that he no longer is accepted by a country that he grew up in. However, I think we as a reader are invited to understand that he has rejected this landscape. He has adopted the fashions and the values of the city, no longer of the natural world. Let's look now at how Ted Hughes builds tension in this part of the story. It's a really important part because it's just here on the second page that the horse first appears. We have these two short sentences. All his senses startled alert. He stopped. Hughes uses these two sentences to build tension. The reader's kept on edge. The pause between the two sentences, I think, evokes the young man's nervousness, the snappiness of his movements as he tries to work out what this new threat is. We're told that we see a thin, black horse. It's worth thinking about those two details a little bit more closely. Let's look at the description of the horse again a little bit more closely. We're told it's thin and that it's black. The thinness, I think, is all the more menacing because it suggests perhaps this creature is emaciated. I wonder if its motivation is perhaps hunger. The blackness is a very gothic image, isn't it? It conveys ideas of death, of darkness, and of evil. The language and the imagery that Ted Hughes uses to describe this thing is very strange at this stage. We seem to be told that it's running like a cat, like a dog up to no good. I think the use of free indirect discourse here suggests perhaps that this young man is no longer quite at ease in the natural world. He's not sure any longer how to interpret the movement of animals. This feeling that this horse isn't quite a horse, and certainly at this stage the young man has no real clue what it is developed as Hughes goes on in his description, when we're told that the horse is actually like a nightmarish leopard. This image of it being nightmarish develops the blackness that we saw in the previous paragraph. I've picked out in the next paragraph now 3 important details of the setting that Hughes evokes for us. We were told that there was a plastering beat of icy rain, that the distance had vanished, and the fields were jumping and streaming. The beat of icy rain is particularly effective at this point. It sets up the later imagery of warfare and of battle that will dominate so much of this story. I think it's important as well that Hughes tells us that the distance had vanished. The young man is now isolated in a world where he doesn't belong, and if you can read my handwriting at that point, that does, I promise you, say isolated. Even the fields were jumping and streaming. Not only does this image of jumping evoke the power and the force of the rain as it beats down on the ground around him, but also suggests that the world itself is coming to life around him. Let's look at his experience as he gets drawn further into this landscape. We're told that his feet suck and splash. You could write really nicely about the use of auditory imagery in that line, and of the image of him plunging to the ankle, conveying how out of control he is in this world. Hughes, at this stage in the story, where I've just marked a line, breaks the action. It's a very effective technique on his part, whereby he can interrupt the relentless, slightly manic progress of the young man as he tries to escape the horse, or at least at this stage find some shelter from the storm. And he uses it to describe the setting that we're in. The pause in this relentless movement of the action actually builds tension, because the reader is left anticipating what the next stage in the man's journey will be. A few details I think are worth considering closely. We're told that the town smouldered like a great heap of blue cinders. I think that's an important detail. Hughes is drawing our attention to the industrial imagery in the town. This again suggests, perhaps inviting us to recall the image of the young man's grey suit, which was so out of place in this natural world. In the next paragraph, we've got some really important details of the description of the wood. We're told that this wood is thin, an interesting repetition of the word that was used to describe the horse earlier on. It's leafless, perhaps again reminding us of the black horse associated with death, certainly of sickness, and the thorns themselves suggest this man is entering a world of pain and suffering. He himself is now blinded by the rain. As a reader, we're really sympathising him at this point for his sheer physical discomfort out in this terrible rain, but also his disorientation. Interestingly, Hughes uses the description of the little crippled trees in the following line, I think, to convey how the man feels about himself at this point. The fact that he can hardly move, his feet are sucking and splashing as we saw a little bit earlier on the page, suggests that he is no longer in control of his own movements. The natural world, in fact, seems to be out to get him. The rain thickens fiercely. Ted Hughes concludes this page with a really powerful passage of action. He invites us to see the man's vulnerability in that he draws his knees up tightly. Any of you who've done your D of E will know this is very odd behaviour for someone out in terribly cold, bitter rain. In fact, he's putting himself at some risk of hypothermia. But he seems to have been losing the capacity for rational thought. The education, the learning that we assume got him his job in the town seems to be of no use to him here. Again, more imagery of bleakness, which recalls the leafless thorns of the previous paragraph. Let's remember now that the distance had vanished. This man is trapped in this world. He has no sense of his own place in it. He doesn't know far or near, and he is completely disorientated. Interestingly, though, Hughes tells us that this man feels hidden and safe. Think for yourself for a moment. Do you sympathise with this young man? Do you feel that you could imagine empathising with him and following the same course of action? Or do you think he's foolish? It's hard to tell what Hughes wants us to feel. Certainly the young man doesn't belong in this world. But should we as readers simply criticise him and regard him as a fool for being there in the first place? We're told that he feels lulled by this environment, and it seems to seal him in. This imagery of protection and warmth at this point in the story, I think, is very powerful, because the reader is distracted from the idea of the horse, which Hughes brought in earlier on the page. Interestingly, we're told that the chilly sheet is replaced with a tight, warm mould. The young man feels secure. Of course, what Hughes is doing at this. But this security, of course, we know is deceptive. This next page shows Ted Hughes inviting us to wonder about the man's mental state. He seems to be obsessed with the rain that he's seeing falling down the trees. We get this lovely visual description of it, glistening, black as iron. But we're also told that he amused himself by the variations in a dribble of water. This is childlike behaviour. In fact, he ends up bringing dwarfs and continents of animals out of its scurfy bark. There's something very strange about him. We are wondering, how far has he actually lost control of his reason? The image of the swaying backdrop of rain certainly vividly evokes for us this man's disturbed, unstable mental state. However, I think what Hughes suggests to us in the next paragraph is really important. The fact that the young man wants this rain to go on forever suggests to us that in fact it's a question of not wanting to admit to himself that he no longer belongs here. It's not wanting to admit defeat. He seems curiously stubborn at this point in the story, but to return to his sodden shoes and his ruined suit would be to admit that he no longer belongs in this world, the world that once he considered his own. Let's look at the next paragraph. We're told that he shivered, he hugged his knees, and the hair on the back of his neck prickled slightly. It almost seems as if he's been reduced to behaving like an animal. And why? It's the horse. The horse seems to have invaded his consciousness somehow. He finds himself thinking of it. He tries to dismiss it, but he can't. What to my mind makes this passage very effective is that Hughes has brought the horse in, not in reality, not through what the man sees, but what through he thinks of. The power of this horse is not just in its appearance, but actually now in its existence in this man's consciousness and his imagination. What we see in this little passage of the story is Ted Hughes using a technique that he is very effective in this story. is an alternation between Interior Monologue, as you can see in these two paragraphs, and then I'll highlight in a different colour. You can see this paragraph in the middle, now marked in blue, offers us action, the world of reality. And in fact, if I go down the page, you can see that this pattern goes on for a little while. At this point here, we have this question in this man's mind about how horses normally behave. They apparently wander around often enough, we're told. It must have come over the crest, again, is a point of his imagination. When the horse actually returns into our vision, I think what's particularly brilliant is the very cinematic way that Ted Hughes does it. The image of the silvered grey light, the black horse standing in stark chiaroscuro contrast to it, is a brilliant moment in the narrative. This technique of chiaroscuro, as we can see that I've just put in the margin for you here and rather ineptly highlighted, is really important. I think this is one of the most extraordinary dramatic moments in any of the short stories that we study. There's nowhere else in any of the stories that build to this sort of intense dramatic climax. And that's what makes this one so distinctive and so effective. What's interesting is the contrast between the horse's behaviour and that of the young man. We're told that its head is high and alert, its ears are pricked, it's watching him. Contrast that with the behaviour of the young man, who shivers, hugs his knees, and the hair on his neck prickles. Where Ted Hughes goes now is particularly wonderful. What we're told is the horse stands perfectly still. And we have this again, this emphasis on the quality of the light. The horse keeps being described in terms of the light, and yet we know its blackness makes it such a dramatic figure in the story. What Ted Hughes does in the final paragraph of the page is he transforms this slow burn, the slow build-up of tension which we've had for the whole of the page, into a sudden, violent outburst of action. We have this crash of a heavy body, the sudden emergence of this warlike imagery which appears in the story, and then an extraordinary pattern of action with the ears flattened, lips lifted back, with the long yellow teeth of the horse. It's a terrifying image. For me, what's most frightening though is the red-veined eyeball. Think about the connotations of blood, of violent desire, of passion, of violence in the horse at this point. Look at how the whole natural world also gets involved in this young man's suffering. We're told he's whipped, he's twisted. But what I find really powerful is we're told that his behaviour is driven by instinct. He's no longer human, he's behaving like an animal. And yet, this image of drumming rain, which we've had before, the word beat was used 2 pages ago, suggesting this nature is almost like an army marching, the drumming keeping it in violent step. The next page sees the two sides of the man's behaviour. Those points highlighted in pink suggest his attempt at this point to think rationally. Let's look at some of the examples here. We're told that the horse is evidently mad. Maybe, sometimes, whatever it was. This is the reflection of somebody trying to come to a rational conclusion about it. It goes in the second paragraph. Incredible, most likely, he recalled. All of this is Ted Hughes evoking for us the young man's attempt to rationalise the situation he's in. But look at the parts that I've highlighted in red. At the same time as he's trying to rationalise his situation, think like a reasoned being, he's also looking for a weapon. He's breaking things, throwing things aside, and wiping the slime of rotten, wet bark from his hands. Ted Hughes keeps building the tension from here on in. There's absolutely no let up in the course of this story, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so effective. Ted Hughes keeps building the tension at this point. The man's behaviour seems to be almost like somebody in a battle. The man's behaviour becomes more and more irrational, and the contrast between his strangely animal-like behaviour And the horse's stillness is particularly effective. We're told the horse is now a ghostly silver in the undercloud light, tall as a statue. There is something deeply unsettling, very supernatural about the way this horse is described. Ted Hughes keeps using this alternating structure between the man's experience of reality and then his internal monologue. These questions that start emerging in this paragraph convey his confusion. He tries to imagine how anybody in their senses could just walk off home. He's clearly feeling utterly no longer in control of his faculties at this stage. I find the final part of this page really effective. We're told that the man observes rather than feeling the rain. He seems disembodied now. He's been so shaken, so troubled by this experience with the horse, that in fact his whole physical experience seems to have left him, and he's now disembodied. He sees what's happening to him, but he doesn't feel it directly. He's so crushed, he expects at every instant to see the horse, and this awful prick-eared black head. That prick-eared makes it seem like its ears are daggers. A frighteningly violent image. The pattern of escape, evasion, and searching for the horse continues for the rest of this page. The language of battle and warfare and manoeuvre, the open field, continues. Even the man decides to withdraw at this point. He creeps up, as if trying to outsmart this horse. But again, Ted Hughes has managed the tension of the story at this point quite brilliantly. The use of a short sentence, he searched the distance, and then this shift back into interior monologue, the horse was quite likely to have forgotten him, is a pattern that the reader is well used to now. This phrase, quite likely, is quite important because again it shows the man trying to rationalise this situation, but as we saw at the top of the page, he can't do that. Every time he tries to rationalise it, he's deceived. Importantly, we see him twisting around wildly. The horse by this stage is now just merely a black shape, no longer even recognisably a horse, and we're told that the man is able to take in only a couple of details: the snort and the spattering whack of its hooves, that wonderful onomatopoeia of spattering whack, to evoke the thing that the man is most aware of, which is the danger, the physical threat of being crushed beneath this animal's feet. And as Hughes goes on to tell us, it seemed to be actually inside his head. Right from the beginning of the story, this horse has existed just as powerfully inside the man's mind as it has out in real life. What Hughes has quite so brilliantly achieved here is not just to have an exterior physical threat or an interior mental disturbance, but to bring the two together. The degeneration of the protagonist of this story continues on this page. We're told that his behaviour is mechanical. He sees the world as if he were watching through thick plate glass, and he has to make an effort to steady his heart. He's losing control of himself, and at this stage, he's aware of it. I think the most important detail on this page is the recognition that the man should no longer act like a fool. He understands that if he is to escape the situation, he has to start behaving like a creature which belongs in this environment. He has to get in touch again with his experience and his knowledge of the natural world. And that's what he does. Suddenly he recollects that a loop of river bordered all this farmland. He draws on his childhood memories. He could follow the 3-mile circuit. He remembered where he was. He returns now to the knowledge and the understanding of this place which will allow him to survive in this threatening, harsh and menacing environment. Ted Hughes is building the tension at this point. In this paragraph here, very effectively, he's establishing the conditions for the final showdown. If the man can get past the horse, if he can escape it, then he'll be safe. If the horse sees him, he'll be dead. We also have this detail of the sky growing darker, the rain is heavier, night is falling, is blurring and the ground drumming. This apocalyptic, terrifying imagery is setting up an incredibly dramatic, vivid climax to the story. All of this imagery of movement, he whirls around, he might have been running, and yet the horse is coming straight for him. We're told it's immensely supple and powerful. Remember back on the first couple of pages where the man's movement was described as sucking, plunging into his ankles. This horse is a perfect expression of this landscape in the form of an animal. He is still out of place, and yet he must respond to the violence of nature with his own violence. He can't outsmart it, he can't outthink it, and so he must fight it. And when he lets out a tearing roar, and then when he flings the second stone, he has to fight nature on its own terms. Ted Hughes, I think, in this story suggests to us very powerfully that firstly, nature is not some nice, pleasant place that we can go and lose ourselves in the weekend or remember from happy childhood memories. It's fierce, it's violent, it's terrifying. And he also suggests that all sorts of clever human knowledge and learning and culture won't help us against it. When nature is violent, the only response it also requires of us is on the same level. We can't kid ourselves that we can outsmart it. What's really shocking about this description is what it does to the man. We're told that when he's flung the stone, he sees the bright mud blotch suddenly appear on the glistening black flank. And then he looks around for stones. The blood is beating in his head and has given him a savage energy. Remember that word beating, which we've seen before in the story so many times to describe the rain, has now been transferred to describe the blood in his head. I think that's really significant. I think it's Hughes again suggesting to us that if this man is to defeat this horse, he can only do it by taking on the same elemental, savage power of nature. In fact, we're told he could have killed the horse. The battle which takes place on this page is brilliantly evoked by Ted Hughes. We might have expected the horse at this point to be defeated, but it's not. In a particularly chilling detail, the horse seems actually to wait for him to run out of stones, and then it dips its head and comes at him. The point when the man is actually able to defeat the horse is when he completely loses any sense of his own humanity. He snatches up stones, he flings them again in his right hand, and he's astonished at the crack of the impact. I think the detail that his aim seemed to be under superior guidance is a really chilling one. It's certainly not God who's aiming his arm at this point, but I think his own natural animal power has come through him. All of the imagery of a young man who was concerned about his nice grey suit and his new shoes, that's completely gone now. He's been transformed into a savage, brutal, killing machine. His victory comes unexpectedly for the reader, and it is what we would call a deeply ambivalent victory. The horse runs away, and the man realises what he's done. The surprise of pity, seeing the horse suffering and shaking its head, I think really moves the reader, because the man suddenly realises the savagery of what he's just done. He has made the horse obedient, and the horse has stopped. But at what cost to the man? What has he been forced to do in order to achieve this victory? I think the imagery of the rain sweeping into his face tells us a lot. It's a horrible realisation. The freezing suggests he's lost his humanity. His flesh is sodden. All of the things he set his value by in the first part of the story, his nice shoes, his expensive suit, they mean nothing, especially after the violence of the outbursts he's just taken part in. And yet, the battle isn't over. He is loaded with stones at this point in the story. And then this final passage of the story represents the man's victory, but what a hollow victory it is. The horse is, we're told, standing with his head high and attentive, and yet his retreat is laborious. The horse was defeated, and yet it's what we might describe as a Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhic victory is one where it's certain that one side won, and yet it's a victory which means very little. It's a victory in name only. The victory came at such a cost in terms of one's moral superiority that you can hardly call it a victory at all. This guy's exhausted by what has just happened to him. His stride is a separate, deliberate effort. This image of sucking earth, which we had earlier in the story, has returned. He fights his breathing. The air rips his lung, and the horse still watch him. As though, even though he's fought it off once, if he were to return, he would have to fight the same battle just again. I find this last page really effective. The man has longed to lay himself out in the rain and take the cooling, healing drops all over his body and forget himself in the last wretchedness of the mud. It almost seems to me as though at this stage in the story he wants nothing more than to give everything up, give his whole life up, and die. This encounter with the horse, with this savage, animalistic power of nature, has left him desiring nothing more than death. In fact, the whole world seems to be dissolving. There's a powerful word for us, like a wet watercolour. I think that's a beautiful image of the colours all dissolving together. The hill looks lifeless and desolate, as though this apocalyptic struggle between man and beast has resulted in death, for him certainly. His return to the farm marks a return to the world of his childhood. Look at all these little details about things he recalls. The swallow nests are still there, we're told. It's exactly as he had left it 12 years ago, and he remembers 3 dead foxes hanging in a row. I think it's important that the man ends in what we might call a true vision of the countryside. Not some nice reassuring confirmation of childhood memories, but the harshness and the difficulty of countryside existence, tractors, plough and binders, of hard work, and also acknowledging that in the countryside life and death exist next to each other. As is so typical for Ted Hughes, he doesn't offer us any nice, happy ending of the story. There's no consolation that the man suddenly realises the error of his ways and he's all happy ever after, and he doesn't see his childhood girlfriend and run away and marry her, and certainly doesn't sit there and think, I'm going to be a better person. This ordeal has left him completely exhausted, emptied of everything. The horse has shrunk from reality, and yet it still exists in his mind. The image of fright and shame, I think, is really important. The confidence with which he began his journey, this return to his childhood home, has now been replaced with fright and shame. He's been humbled and humiliated by his experience. This image of a pain in his chest, like a spike of bone stabbing, certainly suggests to us the awful effect this has had on his consciousness. He wonders if he's strained his heart in a term that we might understand in a medical sense. I think he's strained his heart in a much more spiritual way. That battle, that savagery where he actually desired to kill that horse, has strained his heart in the sense of taking away part of him that was human. So as you reflect on this story and think through what it means for you, ask yourself, is it a question of sympathy? How far do we sympathise with this man? And at what point does your sympathy for him change? Reread the story again and find those points where your response to him changes. Look out for the way that Ted Hughes builds tension. It is a brilliant example of building and sustaining savage narrative tension in this story. Very effective. Look out particularly for those use of that visual imagery of light and dark and of short sentences. And lastly, look at his description of the horse. There is something noble about it, even in its savagery. There's something that sets it apart from the man with all of his arrogance and foolishness. I wonder where actually in the end of the story, where our sympathy is supposed to lie.